For more than 7 decades, Michael Caine has been one of the most recognizable faces in British cinema. From Alfie in The Italian Job to Get Carter, Hannah and Her Sisters, and the Dark Knight trilogy, he built a career that survived changing fashions, changing audiences, and even changing definitions of what a movie star was supposed to be. But Caine has never been the kind of actor who carefully hides his opinions. He came from working-class London, spent years struggling for small acting jobs, served in the military, and spent much of his early career being told that his accent and background made him unsuitable for leading roles. Eventually, he proved those people wrong, yet success didn't make him diplomatic. Throughout his career, Caine occasionally delivered remarkably blunt opinions about fellow performers and filmmakers. Some were jokes, some were criticisms, and a few developed into genuine public feuds. So when people talk about the 5 people Michael Caine supposedly hated, the reality is more interesting than the headline. These weren't necessarily 5 people he despised for life. Some were friends who had explosive disagreements with him. Others represented an approach to filmmaking that Caine simply couldn't tolerate. And one of those conflicts became so vicious that another legendary actor publicly attacked Caine in response. Number 5. Stanley Kubrick. Michael Caine respected great filmmaking, but he had very definite ideas about how actors should be treated. That became especially interesting when he discussed Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was famous for demanding enormous numbers of takes and obsessively controlling almost every detail of his productions. To Kubrick, repetition could reveal something that a performer hadn't discovered yet. Caine saw the process differently. He once described Kubrick as an actor's enemy, arguing that the director's famously painstaking approach could actually work against performances. Caine questioned how an actor could maintain the same emotional truth after dozens upon dozens of takes. His criticism wasn't really about Kubrick's intelligence or talent. It was about philosophy. Caine believed actors needed enough freedom to respond naturally to a scene. Kubrick's method, in his view, could turn that spontaneity into exhaustion. And Caine wasn't shy about pointing to films such as The Shining and A Clockwork Orange when explaining his criticism. He essentially argued that a great movie could still contain performances he personally didn't admire. That was a very Michael Caine thing to say. He could respect the achievement while still telling you exactly what he thought was wrong with it. Number 4. Michael Winner. Michael Winner was not an actor, but he deserves a place in this story because his relationship with Caine was one of the strangest. Winner directed Caine in several films, including Death Wish 3, and their relationship could be explosive. Winner had a reputation for being loud, demanding, and difficult, but there was another side to the relationship. Caine later remembered their first meeting and admitted that his initial impression of Winner was completely wrong. He described Winner as appearing kind and gentle at first, only to discover that the director could become extremely unpleasant once he knew someone better. Winner deliberately tested people. He wanted to know how far he could push them before they finally turned against him. Caine told a story about confronting him directly and essentially saying that Winner could push him as far as he wanted, but Caine wasn't going to dislike him. That apparently changed something between them. Instead of becoming enemies, they became friends. And that's exactly why putting Winner on a literal people Caine hated list would be misleading. Caine didn't ultimately hate him. In fact, when Winner died, Caine spoke warmly about him and remembered him as a complicated but ultimately tender friend. Their relationship proves something important about Caine's personality. Sometimes his harshest reactions weren't permanent hatred. Sometimes they were simply his way of dealing with difficult personalities. Number 3. Richard Burton. Now we reach one of the more controversial chapters. In 1995, Caine made a remark about 3 legendary British actors: Richard Burton, Richard Harris, and Peter O'Toole. He referred to them collectively as drunks. The comment caused an immediate backlash. Burton had already died by that point, but Harris was furious. And Harris did not respond quietly. He fired back with an extremely personal attack on Caine, questioning his importance as an actor and insulting him in remarkably harsh language. The exchange became one of the great celebrity feuds of British cinema. But there was an uncomfortable truth underneath the controversy. Burton, Harris, and O'Toole had genuinely developed reputations for heavy drinking during their younger years. They belonged to a generation of actors whose off-screen lives could be almost as legendary as their performances. Caine had personally witnessed some of that lifestyle. He had even experienced it himself. During his early years, Caine was understudy to Peter O'Toole in the theater. One legendary night ended with the two men waking up in a strange apartment after an extended drinking session. Caine couldn't remember how they had gotten there. That experience became one of the stories associated with the wild theater culture surrounding O'Toole and his friends. So Caine's comment didn't come from someone who had never encountered that world. He had been close enough to see it firsthand. Still, calling Burton, Harris, and O'Toole drunks reduced enormously talented men to one aspect of their lives. Harris clearly thought Caine had crossed a line, and the resulting feud became much more personal than Caine probably expected. Number 2. Peter O'Toole. The inclusion of Peter O'Toole is complicated because Caine and O'Toole weren't simply enemies. Quite the opposite. Their relationship went back to the theater, before either man had become an international star. Caine had been O'Toole's understudy, and the younger actor was fascinated by the charisma and unpredictability of the future Lawrence of Arabia star. But Caine also saw the darker side of O'Toole's lifestyle. Their infamous drinking adventure became part of both men's mythology. After going out together, Caine eventually woke up in an unfamiliar apartment. When he asked what time it was, O'Toole reportedly responded with a much more important question. What day was it? They had lost track of an enormous amount of time. The story is funny now, but it also illustrates the culture Caine eventually became critical of. Caine wasn't interested in romanticizing self-destruction. He had spent years working his way up from poverty and obscurity. He understood how easily an actor could throw away a career through arrogance, addiction, or lack of discipline. That's why his comments about O'Toole, Burton, and Harris were so controversial. They weren't coming from someone who didn't know them. They came from someone who had been part of their world. And perhaps that's why they hurt so much. Number 1. Richard Harris. If there was one name connected to Caine's most famous public feud, it was Richard Harris. Their dispute erupted after Caine's comments about Harris, Burton, and O'Toole. Harris responded with a blistering letter attacking Caine personally. He described Caine in terms that were so insulting they became news stories in their own right. Suddenly, two highly respected British actors were engaged in a very public war of words. This wasn't a fictional argument between characters. It wasn't a scene from a movie. It was two real actors with decades of experience publicly questioning each other's reputations. Caine, however, didn't respond with another barrage of insults. Instead, he essentially refused to participate further. When asked about Harris's response, Caine reportedly said he hadn't read the letter and wasn't interested in reading it. That response was almost more revealing than another insult would have been. Caine had said what he wanted to say. Harris had answered, and Caine wasn't going to spend the rest of his life fighting over it. Ironically, the feud also demonstrated something about Caine's personality. He could be brutally direct, but he didn't necessarily need the final word. He had already survived decades of people telling him he wasn't good enough. He had been rejected because of his accent. He had spent years taking tiny roles. He had watched other actors receive opportunities he desperately wanted. Eventually, he became one of the most successful actors of his generation. Perhaps that experience taught him that careers last longer than arguments. The people who criticized him in the 1950s disappeared. The people who mocked his accent became irrelevant. The producers who didn't believe he could become a star were eventually proven wrong. And Caine kept working. The real Michael Caine. That's what makes the 5 people Michael Caine hated story more complicated than it initially appears. Caine wasn't famous for carrying endless grudges. He was famous for having opinions. Sometimes those opinions were funny. Sometimes they were brutally honest. And occasionally, they created genuine enemies. But he also maintained friendships with people who were very different from him. He became close to actors such as Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and others throughout his career. He worked repeatedly with people whose personalities and working methods differed dramatically from his own. He also understood the difference between criticizing someone's behavior and denying their talent. Even when he disliked something about a performer or director, he could still acknowledge their greatness.